This is a production of Cornell University.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here with you today. Thank you for that introduction. So today I'm going to tell you a little bit more about myself. Since I'm new here, I wanted to give you a chance to get to know me a little bit better. And then I'm going to talk with you about one of the foundational studies that my lab is kind of founded on and is the basis of some ongoing work that we're exploring now. I'll talk to you a little bit about some of the future research directions that I have. And then I'd love to answer any questions that come up for you at the end. And throughout my talk today, I am going to invite you to engage in a few very low-key activities. I promise they're not too bad. So just when we get there, I'll let you know, and you can decide if you want to participate or not. So with that, so as was mentioned, I'm from a really small town in the northeast corner of Wyoming. This is Devil's Tower National Monument, and that is 8 miles from my hometown. So that's, looks like home to me. And for as long as I can remember, I've been really interested in both science and education. And it took me many years to discover that there's actually a field that exists at the intersection of those two main disciplines called discipline-based education research. And what discipline-based education research is you use the tools and the methods of education and the social sciences combined with the content, values, norms of specific science disciplines to ask and answer questions about how people learn and how people teach and how people get mentored, right, within those fields. But at the same time, I was really interested in also pursuing a career in disability services. So as was mentioned, I did my undergraduate degrees at the University of Wyoming. And so I was really interested in microbiology and biology, but also training to be a high school science teacher at that time. And I was also really interested in thinking about how to help people access educational opportunities. So I worked in several different roles in a disability services office there. And in these roles, I was fortunate to interact with many students and faculty. And I started to observe that the STEM majors I was working with were having pretty unique experiences accessing and using academic accommodations. So those are things like extended time exam accommodations or note-taking accommodations within their courses. And I would also interact with a lot of faculty who are really interested in learning how to better support students using accommodations in their classes. But at that time, when I looked into the literature, this field of discipline-based education research that I had been learning about within biology education research articles, there were truly like 0 articles that just focused on students with disabilities. And so over time, that started to bother me. And so I decided to apply to graduate school so I could conduct research kind of in this intersection of science, education, and disability access. And so I went to graduate school at the University of Georgia, and I earned my PhD in plant biology. And so for the bench side of my research, I was advised by Dr. Chang-Young Kong in our rice blast lab. And so I studied mechanisms of nuclear migration in the rice blast fungus. And I did a lot of microscopy. So that's me and Imogene, our LSM 880, who spent a lot of hours together. And so some of the work that I did in this area, if I can get my slides to advance here, I could summarize with these keywords down here. So I studied mechanisms of mitosis, nuclear structure, kinesin, dynein, motor proteins, and did a ton of microscopy. And so these are some of the papers I published based off of that side of my dissertation. But at the same time, I was also learning how to do biology education research. And so I worked with Dr. Julie Stanton in her biology education research lab, as well as with Aaron Dolan in the social psychology research experiences and education lab to learn, how to run a discipline-based education research group, essentially, and how to do that work. And so since then, I went on to found my own lab. I call it the Equip Lab. And we started off at the University of Mississippi. So we started in January of 2024. And some of the highlights for me have really been the opportunity to mentor. So I've had the opportunity to mentor a postdoc, 3 graduate students, and 12 undergraduates. And some may say 12 undergraduates at one time is too many. Maybe it was quite a lot, but it was really exciting and fun. And we were fortunate to have 2 NSF grants. Only one of them got canceled, so that's great. And I've been able to put out 6 corresponding author papers, and 2 of those are in review right now. So that's kind of the overview of kind of where I've been and where I'm at now. And a lot of the work that I've done so far has really centered on students with disabilities. And so what we know about the number of students with disabilities in college at the undergraduate level is that the number of students is increasing. And so in 1996, just 6% of college students report having a disability. But in 2016, nearly 20% of college students report having a disability. And I just want to note too that these 2016 numbers, those are the most updated statistics that we can actually get on this population at the national level. So, So what we also know is that many students with disabilities will initially pursue a STEM major when they come to college. And in some cases, students with disabilities are actually more likely counterparts to pursue a STEM major. So people are really interested in pursuing STEM. However, relatively few students with disabilities will go on to complete their STEM degree. Oh my gosh, there we go. So we consider students with disabilities to be underrepresented in STEM majors. And even research about students with disabilities is also underrepresented. And so what this means to me as a researcher is there's a couple of really important impacts, right? So there's that fact, but let's kind of take a step back and think about what this really means. So what we know is that kind of at the surface level, this is an issue of equity and justice, right? It means that people who are interested and motivated and are seeking out these opportunities are being systematically pushed out due to the presumptuous, we're going to assume there's some barriers here, right, that are pushing people out. But we could also make an argument that this is limiting scientific innovation and discovery. And that's because we know that scientists with disabilities have made and continue to make really important contributions to fundamental science and also applied science, right? And so here is just 3 examples of folks who have disabilities, like the students I'm going to tell you about today, who have made major accomplishments, right? So Dr. Greider, Dr. Dubochet, and Dr. Adam Pocock, 2 of them are Nobel Prize winners. And Dr. Adam Pocock, she's a very well-renowned science communicator and has recently been the president of the British Science Association. And so the point that I'm trying to make here is that when we systematically push out disabled people from STEM, we're limiting ourselves, right? Because there's a lot of opportunity for future scientific innovation that's being lost. So in the Equip Lab, we're really interested in trying to address some of the systemic barriers that exist that are pushing people out of STEM. But in order to do this well, we really need evidence, right, to support the decisions that we make as educators and as policymakers within our department. So research in my lab really is seeking to generate fundamental knowledge about how people with disabilities navigate our current STEM systems, and then translate this knowledge to help design supports for students and for instructors, and to provide the types of data that we need to make informed policy decisions. So the research that I've done so far has kind of spanned these 3 themes or realms. So the learning realm, the mentoring realm, and the working realm. So these are some of the research questions we ask. So at the learning level, we can ask questions like, how do students with disabilities experience their STEM courses? And what opportunities exist from understanding those experiences to build more supportive STEM courses? At the mentoring level, we've looked at how graduate students with disabilities see themselves as researchers and what science departments can do to help foster science identity for these students. And at the working level, we have some preliminary work that's looked at how biology faculty with disabilities experience their work. And from this work, we're able to make some suggestions about what we could do to make those experiences more supportive. So today, actually for the rest of our time together, I'm going to try to convince you that this work is really important in order for us to understand and characterize some of the discipline-specific barriers that exist for folks with disabilities. And from this work, be able to offer relevant and actionable solutions. And for the rest of our time together, I'm just really going to focus in on this learning kind of level of questions. And I wanted to tell you, like I said, tell you a story about a foundational study that my group has done or that I've done. And this is really looked at how active learning in undergraduate STEM courses affects students' perceptions of learning. And this work was published a couple years ago in one of our field's leading journals, which is called CBE Life Sciences Education. And so here is an opportunity for y'all to participate if you'd like. I'm going to invite you to turn to someone sitting next to you and maybe take 1 or 2 minutes just to talk about this question. How do you define active learning? And if you've never heard about it or never thought about it, that's okay too. This is a time to kind of check in and see where your peers are. So go ahead, it should get loud as we're talking to each other. I'll bring us back together in a couple minutes. Well, everybody, thank you for engaging in that activity. While I was kind of bopping around, I heard a couple things that I wanted to call out. So I heard someone say it's pretty much anything other than lecture. And I also noticed that people were giving like specific examples of times maybe they've experienced active learning. And that is pretty well aligned with how I define active learning. And so I define active learning as what happens when the instructor stops talking and students will engage in exercises that help them develop higher level thinking skills. We're having a couple of technical issues, so we'll keep moving just for the interest of time right now. So active learning, what we know about active learning through a lot of research and meta-analyses is that it can help instructors or help students move beyond simple memorization and recall to develop those higher order thinking skills. But as a field, we're still developing our understanding of what types of active learning practices work best and for what groups of students. So for example, in the work that I'm going to tell you about today, before the study was done, there was very little, if any, empirical evidence about what students were actually experiencing within active learning STEM courses, so students with disabilities. But we can imagine that for some students, active learning could be quite beneficial, right? For example, there might be less lecture and more opportunities for engagement, which can support student learning. It gives us cognitive breaks, right? It refreshes our brains and helps us kind of to come back and pay attention again. Some practices like group work will actually increase interactions, right? And that can place stress on students. So the motivation for this study was really to gain insight into student perceptions of active learning. And as a research team, we thought these perceptions were really important because we considered each participant to be an expert about their own experiences in the classroom. And we know that STEM courses were designed with little, if any, input from students with disabilities. So the data I'm going to talk to you more about today were actually collected as part of a larger study of student self-advocacy. And self-advocacy is how students go about accessing and using accommodations in their courses. And so the first 2 papers are kind of shown over here from the self-advocacy study. And across those 2 papers, they were downloaded or accessed over 20,000 times. So to do this work, I formed a partnership with an institutional disability resource center. And I interviewed 25 STEM majors who were all registered and using accommodations with a particular disability resource center. And all the students had ADHD and or specific learning disorders. And so today we might use terms like neurodivergent to describe this group of students. But at the time data were collected, that was not a very common phrase used by students. So students with ADHD and or SLD. So ADHD stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. And SLD is a specific learning disability in reading, writing, or math. And so this group of disabilities also used to be called dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia. Both are really common in college, and they're both examples of non-apparent disabilities. And what I mean by a non-apparent disability is if you were to look at this group of students here, you're not able to tell based on a student's outward appearance, right, who may or may not have ADHD or SLD. And so when we think about classroom experiences, because these are both common non-apparent disabilities, we think of folks as having common classroom experiences. So during the interview that I conducted with students, they discussed their experiences in an active learning or in various active learning STEM courses. And one of the interview questions they responded to was, do you learn better in a STEM course that uses lecture or active learning, and why do you think this is? And data were analyzed using a qualitative approach, where as a research team, we read interview transcripts that were over 700 pages worth of material. As we went through these interview transcripts, we identified salient pieces of data to address our research questions. And then we did this over and over and over again until we felt like we could make, essentially apply what we call a code book or rubric to the data and consistently get the same things when we went through an interview together. And so we did this analysis as a neurodiverse team. So some of us identify as having ADHD and or SLD, and some of us did not. We thought that really strengthened our analysis, right? Because we could talk about it from multiple perspectives, the data, that is. So the output of this type of work, if you're new to qualitative work, is we actually consider our participant quotes, right, to be our evidence. And we use these quotes to build up claims. So we are going to show major ideas or themes that come from this analysis. So a couple of generalizability considerations. So overall in our study, most of the participants said that active learning best supported their learning compared to lecture. And I want to be really clear that the results that I'm going to show you are not making claims about the efficacy of a single practice, but instead, right, these are student perceptions of their learning experiences. So overall, while most people thought that active learning was more supportive for their learning, there were some variations. So for example, this is a participant whose pseudonym is called Brett, or he's called Brett. He said, with my ADHD, it's great to get some energy out. Distractions are there for everyone, and you can work through them easier than in a lecture where if you get distracted, you miss stuff. So for Brett, he felt like active learning was really helpful. But his quote was in direct contrast to quotes from participants like Jesse, who said, I don't like active learning. I kind of hate it when they put me in there. It really bothers me. It was a stressful class. And so as a team, when we were analyzing our data, we were really trying to understand, okay, they're talking about the same thing. Why are there such varied perceptions of these practices? And so through our analysis, we identified what we call influential aspects of active learning. So these were kind of the big themes that people were talking about. And so participants discussed the use of clicker questions, or these are like real-time polling devices, group work, flipped courses, some of the course materials that they frequently encountered in active learning STEM courses, as well as the ways in which the video is blocking this here, but it says instructor reveals thinking. So how the instructor actually teaches and it shares feedback to the class. The course structure, which referred to some of the policies and frequent assignments that could be characteristic of an active learning STEM course, and the actual environment itself. So talking about the physical space and the classroom climate. And so for each of these influential aspects, we identified, I'm going to show this as a figure, where each box is going to represent a different one of those themes, and they're arranged from more general to kind of more specific active learning aspects. And so here, again, are all those aspects I just talked to you about. And in our analysis, we identified how that particular practice could support perceptions of learning from our participants' interviews, as well as how the interview or the aspect hindered their perceptions of learning. And what we found is that actually many of the supports were already known. So essentially, all of the things that the literature said was good about active learning could be good for participants too. So for example, for clicker questions, one of the benefits or one of the reasons why participants thought that supported their learning is that the clicker questions help promote their metacognition. And that means those clicker questions can help them more readily identify what they know or what they don't know about a topic, right? So then it tells you what you should go study after class, essentially. So really what we became most interested in at this point in our analysis was how does active learning hinder perceptions of learning? Because this was new and novel within the data or within the literature. So what we saw overall was that when active learning was perceived to hinder perceptions of learning, it wasn't so much about the practice itself, it was more about how the instructor was using that practice. And I'm going to walk you through some examples of this related to clicker questions, group work, and flipped courses. And as we go through these examples, I want you to think about how is this practice being implemented by the instructor. So let's talk about clicker questions. So one of the ways that our participants reported clicker questions could hinder their perceptions of learning was when the instructor would pose an open-ended clicker question. And all of the classes' responses would be shown kind of like flying in through whatever polling software that you're using. So let's say you're teaching or you're taking a cell biology class, and maybe your instructor has just asked a question about the difference between co and post-translational translocation. And you as a student see something like this, right, come through the screen. It kind of just dominates your screen. So this flood of free responses is what the participant quote is going to reference. So Casey was describing why this practice hindered her perceptions of learning. And she said, with free response clicker questions, the technology is weird. Some people do the answers in all capital letters. Some people do them in all lowercase letters. Some people do them in both kind of letters. Some people put in commas, some people don't. That's so stressful for me. It's not organized in any way. So this is one way that clicker questions, right, hindered her perceptions of learning in an active learning STEM course. The other example was about group work. And so we define this pretty broadly as any time a participant described working with another student in an undergraduate STEM course. And these data were really interesting to us because they're going to talk about a situation in which a student has been assigned to be the reader or the writer for their group. And as education researchers, we tend to think of this as actually an inclusive practice, right? It's giving people an expectation so you know what you should be doing when you're interacting with other people. But here, we're learning something new from Jack, and he's a student who has an SLD in reading. And he said, I wish they would understand, talking about his instructors, why I never like reading in groups, like out loud reading, or why I don't like writing by hand in front of them, peers. If they knew why I didn't want to read out loud or why I didn't want to write, then they probably wouldn't make me. If they knew why I was struggling, it'd be better than them just thinking I was not capable. And so Jack here was really wishing that he had an out, right, where he did not have to be in the reader or writer role, like as assigned by the instructor when he was doing group work. And then finally, this last example I'll walk you through today was about flipped courses. And flipped courses, have y'all heard of those before? Okay, lots of head nods, right? So this is when students are presented with material outside of class. They're meant to get introduced to that topic and then come to class and engage in some sort of work related to that topic. And for our participants, flipped courses could be like some of the most profound barriers that they encountered. And these were times when they would actually have to withdraw from classes. And it was because of so a couple of different factors that I'll show you in this long quote. So we had 2 participants who withdrew from flipped courses. And I'm going to share an example quote of why this happened from Bryce. So Bryce's quote is long, it's going to go across 2 pages, but this is what he said. He said, the reason I withdrew was due to the flipped classroom setting. Basically, it was 80 to 100 pages of reading in between classes and the textbook. And that was essentially how you were supposed to teach yourself the course. In terms of what we actually did in class, I was amazed. There was no lecture component to the course whatsoever. You would walk into the course, you would sit down, and then immediately at the start of the course, you would start answering the clicker questions. And after each question, there was no explanation of why that was the answer. It was, let's just move on to the next question. When I was doing the reading, I wasn't pulling all the information in. I was struggling on these questions in class, and I had no lecture, no component to where I was getting taught the information. I struggled so much that I felt there was no way I was going to succeed, and that was the main reason I withdrew. So there's a lot going on in that situation, but some of the kind of bigger takeaways that we could see in these data, one of the reasons that Bryce had to withdraw was there was only one option, right, to get that information. It was all from a textbook, and it was a lot of reading, and there was no audio version of that textbook available to him. He has an SLD reading. So there's no other way for him to prepare for class. And so that's not really an accessible practice, right, for all the students in the course. The other thing we could see in these data is that there was a lack of instructor explanation following clicker questions. And so this is what we consider to be an example of how that practice is being implemented, right? By themselves, clicker questions can be useful, but there's also that explanation piece that an instructor should be doing to help kind of explain why that answer is the correct answer. So here's another opportunity for you to chat with your neighbor. And I've shared some of the examples that come to my mind and to our team's mind after we read these data, but I'm curious if you see anything different. So which what teaching recommendations do you see related to clicker questions, group work, and flipped courses? So again, you can turn to your neighbor and chat about it, and then we'll come back together.
Yeah, I think
it's like less saying that I definitely want to take her question. I really said, yeah,
I hope that.
And then like, and I was filming and they would all like create but still into that way. But like makes it much easier to away exactly like make sure they it's too much question. Like I so I really the question is harder.
And what? So I'm curious, would anyone feel comfortable sharing what you and your group talked about? What were some of the teaching recommendations that came to your mind? Seeing some of these data.
Well, we talked about clicker questions
Okay.
and how if you're going to use clicker questions, like our perception of them are to understand if people grasp the concepts. And so if your professor is not ready to address that as like, if you're going to take like active answers, like maybe just don't do it.
Yeah, I think that's a fair question as an instructor to think about. You know, thinking about what answers you might get ahead of time and how you might respond to them can be useful. But I do want to acknowledge, like, that's really hard to do when you're first learning how to teach a class, right? And it's also, but it's something that you could probably build up over time. And there's also some research that you could probably go look at too to help you get maybe a sense of what you could potentially see. Yeah, yeah.
Just to like build off on that, I think clicker questions, like the way you could do it, like either way, you can like have them more like focus on like the students, but you can also definitely clicker questions could also be more like as a tool for the professor, like kind of like what G was saying,
Yeah.
in terms of like, you know, especially like from the classes that I've been in, especially when the clicker questions are like live feed, so you see the questions going in. You're like, I feel like personally, like you will never get a representative answer of like what your student body, because like everyone's just gonna like put the answer that's like coming in most readily. So like there's definitely ways to do it, like kind of what you were talking about implementation wise.
Yeah, so thinking about the implementation of it for sure. And I think maybe I saw a hand over here.
Well, I don't know if I had raised it earlier, but we talked about the value in not doing everything only one way. Like
Yeah.
giving choices, like maybe it's not all clicker questions, maybe it's not all group work, maybe there's not only one way to learn or teach yourself the course content and having some variability.
Yeah, I love that. I'm gonna talk more about that too. Great idea. Any other thoughts, maybe from the back of the room? Anything that came to your minds?
Yeah, we thought it was interesting in the case of the individual who didn't want to have to be reading or writing group work, that it just seemed, certainly the teacher must have been aware that their course had this disability, or hopefully they were, and that it was just a matter of not being flexible enough with
Yeah,
the way that they're going to teach the course.
yeah. I appreciate that comment, and something I realized that I should mention too, as instructors, you don't know what people have, right? Like you just get a letter typically that will say things like you have extended time, or someone might need a note taker. So you as the instructor may not know what the, what the disability is or what that student's needs are. So it can be kind of tricky, but this is actually a really good segue. So these were some of the kind of higher, I don't want to say higher level, but some of the immediate things that you might consider doing. And one of them that's I think has come up kind of as a starting point is you could limit those short answer displays. Maybe in a class of 200 people, you just really want A, B, C, or D, kind of a multiple choice question, right? That could help collate that a little bit. Or if you are interested in seeing all those three responses, maybe that's the kind of question you end your class with, right? So that you as the instructor would have time to go through, collate that, and bring it back at the start of the next class. That could be effective. The other thing related to that idea we talked about with group work, something we could see is like, maybe it's important as the instructor to offer outs from those assigned roles. So you could have suggested roles, but you can have flexibility in who takes up that role to kind of help manage that situation. And there's a lot of other potential teaching suggestions here. And so what we did in this paper is we made a giant list of all the teaching suggestions we could think of. And so there's a link to these suggestions here, and it's table 4, and it's really hard to see in here, but the ones that are bolded, if you look at the paper, those are the ones that students themselves suggested. And so that, might be a nice starting point to kind of prioritize as you're considering how you might go about doing this if you wanted to in your class. And so some of the impacts of this paper is that this was one of the first kind of systematic studies of how students with ADHD and or SLD are experiencing active learning in undergraduate STEM courses. And it identifies some of the ways that we can optimize active learning for this population of students. This paper has been downloaded over 10,000 times, and I've received many invites to speak about this work. And so I hope you can see that this type of work has strong potential to enhance the experiences of many future students in undergraduate STEM courses. And related to the idea we talked about offering choices, something that we could really see across the data, and if you had a chance to go through some of those teaching suggestions in more detail, is that there's a need for more universal design for learning in active learning STEM courses. And I'm going to tell you what that is. So universal design for learning is an approach. It's actually a pedagogical framework that started, it's been over 20 years, and it actually started from a concept in architecture where we want to build buildings and physical environments with access in mind from the start, because it's easier to plan that proactively than retroactively go in and provide accommodations or to make modifications. So it's a teaching approach that's intended to create learning environments that are usable by all people to the greatest extent possible without the need for adoption. So it's about helping people proactively plan for differences in students and learner needs. So it's really was first designed to support access for disabled people, but it can benefit everyone. And there's 3 big principles here where you want to design your courses and your content to provide multiple means of engagement, representation, and action and expression. And each of these principles are broken down into like much more specific guidelines. And if you were to look at all of those guidelines, it can be a little bit overwhelming. And so that's the direction kind of for the next chapter of research in my lab, is we want to broaden how we're thinking about access and how we study access in STEM. And so one of the directions we're going to go in is diving deeper into how we can help instructors use universal design for learning in undergraduate STEM courses. And so some of the projects we're hoping to get off the ground here soon are actually doing some studies of instructor and how they approach their teaching of instructors rather. So we want to help characterize what exactly are universal teaching practices within undergraduate STEM courses, how do instructors implement these practices, and why do they decide to implement these practices? And so we're hoping that this can help address a pretty major gap that we see between theory and practice within education fields. And so that's actually where I'm going to leave it for today. But I wanted to say thank you to folks who helped with the active learning study that I told you about. And then these are all the folks that I've had the chance to work with so far in my lab. And I'd love to answer any questions that you might have.
Yeah, so are there questions?
Yeah, Collins and then you.
Okay, 3 questions. You can choose one to answer.
Okay.
One is, where do you see AI being involved in all your approaches?
Okay.
The other one is, have you thought about virtual reality? Would it be maybe overstimulation?
Mhm.
And the other one is, have you thought about any way we can engage farmers on unconditional teaching and credit teaching extension? Like, I had another one.
Okay, feel free, I'm gonna cut you off. Okay, okay, first question, AI. Yes, something that I think is interesting is how instructors might use AI to help decide what options to offer to students, right, to meet various learning needs. So kind of as an assistant, I guess, to figure out what you might want to like bring options into. And I think there's also avenues for like students to use AI too, right? And for us to understand those interactions. So one idea is thinking about like, can AI help support students, neurodivergent students specifically in group work, right? So we know that people use AI for coaching, like interpersonal coaching. And so we're wondering if there might be a way for students to use AI to do group work too, to help them with group work. Virtual reality, there is some really cool work where chemistry education researchers have done this. They've developed modules for graduate teaching assistants to learn how to bring universal design for learning into their classes and how to kind of respond in the moment to student thinking. So virtual reality. And then the last question, I forgot, can you remind me?
Extension.
Extension. Okay, I think there's this universal design for learning. Try to go back. I think universal design for learning is meant for all people, right? It's not just students. And so I think there could be opportunities as you're thinking about the products you develop or the presentations that you give, bringing in some of that, those universal design for learning principles could be really valuable, right? So it should give all of your growers, all of your stakeholders access. And I also want to point out, UDL is a really, really good starting point, and we want people to use it, but it's never going to replace the need for accommodation as well, right? It's both. So we want to plan proactively, but then be prepared to provide accommodation. So you need kind of both strategies there. Thank you. And then I think you had to put your hand up.
Yeah, thanks for your talk. I had a question. One of the points you made was about course structure. So do you have any particular recommendations for building a syllabus that's inclusive and maybe will contribute to active learning in some way, but maybe a syllabus that's particularly for a class that's like a big lecture, 300-person STEM class?
Yeah, I think those are great questions. So, so there's definitely recommendations for how you can build more, I would say, like engaging syllabi, right? And so some of the things people think about are having, instead of having all of the legalese and all of the policies from the university on your first page, try to put that at the end, and to really center thinking about like how students want to engage with it and make it a document that they want to look at. So like pictures are helpful, kind of explaining things, and having in my own syllabi, in terms of access, I like to have a lot of clickable links so that you can go directly to the thing that you need on the table of contents versus like scrolling and scrolling and scrolling. I think the other point that you bring up is this idea of structure. And I would say that as a researcher, I don't really know how to recommend you because we don't have a lot of strong evidence yet on what works best for people. Some things that I personally am drawn to are offering options, right? So building in options. And so some folks that I think are doing this well, what they do is they'll have different paths to earn an A in a class, right? So you might have a path where you're taking a quiz every week, you're doing a high structured class, right? And that could be really beneficial. But for some people that does not work, right? And so they might opt for like, I just want the 4 exam option. And then what the instructor does is they calculate the grade all of the ways and you get the best grade, like from those schemes. So there's a couple of people I can like specifically show you examples of that do it that way. But that's, yeah, thoughts there. Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah.
Great talk, thank you. I was curious if in your study you noticed any sort of like gender differences. I know that with ADHD, the like symptoms or maybe struggles that they have can be very different for like men, women, and there's research on that. So I was wondering if your data supported that. I thought it was really interesting, the example you gave. You referred to one of them as a he and one of them as a her. And so they had very different like struggles with the same type of teaching style. So I was wondering how that showed up in your data.
Yeah, so the question was about if we saw any gender differences within participant experiences in our active learning study. And so we did not deeply analyze our data for gender differences. Something that came up in the previous papers, the self-advocacy study, is we definitely saw differences in how women get diagnosed, right? And those diagnosis stories are different than our male participants, and that tracks with like other research too, right? And so to be more specific there, right, like for some women, it was harder to get diagnoses like of ADHD compared to some of the men, so they tended to be like diagnosed later in life. And that has implications for how you learn to navigate accommodations, like in a formal setting. Yeah. Yes.
There are a lot of really interesting takeaways from this presentation, and it's been really insightful to listen upon. So I had been at a state school for my undergraduate institution where many of the students had done some time at community college, and you notice a stark difference at R1 or D1 institutions that are very research oriented, where a lot of the students who have been at community college are giving feedback that the teaching is the worst that they have ever experienced. Simultaneously, from the faculty side, you can see that the way that they go about pedagogy or lack thereof, that teaching is rather a requirement that they are forced to meet, and actually have taken no teaching or pedagogy courses that are outside of the required maybe 3-4 week seminar. How do you go about teaching instructors to care about pedagogy at R1 institutions where they're required to teach in order to make tenure track positions?
Yeah. Oh, wow. That's a great question. So yep, there is a difference by institution type for sure, right? And we can see that across like the deeper literature, right? Tracking with some of those things we know anecdotally. I think to make people care, right, that is a multi-pronged approach that we need, right? Because I think it has to be, the idea that's coming to my mind is like some carrot and some stick, right? But also we need people to care, and I don't know how much we can really change people inside if they don't care. But there are other things that we can use to incentivize teaching. And so I think a lot of that, like kind of getting on a soapbox here, but we also need to value teaching, right? Like how that gets evaluated in people's tenure and promotion packets, that's part of it. It's not the only thing. And so I think working together to change that culture. And I realize that is kind of an unsatisfying answer, but I think it's a really tough problem, right? And it's something that it's going to take a lot of people working together. And the thing that I think about is, you know, sometimes you don't need a whole group of people to change, you just need a couple people, right? And so working with what you can get, and we're pushing towards, you know, something different too.
Especially if you get the opportunity to do empirical and qualitative based research, right? Then there's more information supporting the fact that this does work and it is important, even if they haven't been given opportunities to expand on their pedagogy in their own course.
Yeah. And I think too, the other thing I want to just kind of acknowledge is like, to be a good teacher is hard work, right? It takes a lot of time, and we're all really strapped for time. And so that's something that, like, you know, something that I hope I can contribute is helping people refine, like, okay, what should you really prioritize, right? Because there's so much that we're told that we need to do in our classrooms, helping to curate that a little bit and say, okay, as a starting point, do this, right? And then this is going to be something that gets better over time, and you can add to it as you feel comfortable, because it is overwhelming, right? And so I don't want to say it's all their fault, because it's not. It's like, it's challenging. We're all in a system. We're all affected by the same things. Yeah, I think you had your hand up too.
Yeah, no, I was just asking about in terms of like some of the quotes and like the research that you had done. Like, was there kind of going in the same direction? Like, was there differences in like the type of STEM class that you pulled from? Because for I think like especially with like, I can only speak upon the ADHD portion of it, but like visual, like some classes better at some like topics are better suited for like visual aspects versus like chemistry. I can imagine it's like really difficult for that. So like I was just kind of curious like where the like accounts that you got in this presentation came from, if there was a specific class, or did you kind of like how did you source the surveys, I guess?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we took a broad STEM perspective on this. So everyone was a STEM major, and we used Natural Science Foundation disciplines to decide what was a STEM major or not. And then we had students name specific courses. Like in the interview, I would ask them to think about an active learning course that they had recently taken. And so most of our students were from life sciences and engineering. We have a couple that are from chemistry and physics. but mostly biology actually is where most of our participants are coming from. But I would say too, remember, right, like we think about majors, but a lot of students end up taking some of those same introductory level classes. And so we didn't really get into differences between disciplines. However, we're doing a follow-up study right now, and we're seeing a little bit of that. So something that people talk about in chemistry specifically is like, it's really hard to visualize atoms, right? And so any way that we can help students visualize atoms can be beneficial to them.
I have a question for next steps. Is your Equip Lab planning on hosting any sort of workshops in the future for like TAs and faculty to make, more inclusive syllabi and courses?
Yeah, that's a great question. Not currently, but I think part of my teaching portfolio will be like a graduate level, undergraduate level teaching course. And so I would love to bring in some of the, principles and ideas that I've talked about today into that class.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.